Welcome back to our continued series of lectures on the executive branch. And today, in this lecture, we're going to be looking specifically at the vice president, and then we'll turn our attention to the executive departments that make up much of the executive branch. So we'll get ready for our footstep journey through the executive branch. And as always, please look at the images and the text that I provide to help orient you with your note-taking. I'm also going to start embedding some questions or tasks for you to complete during these video lectures to make them a little bit more interactive and to get you to reflect and self-assess a little bit about what it is we're learning, what you're hearing, and hopefully comprehending. So we're going to get started right away, and here are the topics. I think I just outlined them, but the office of the vice president, we'll take a look at the early history of the vice presidency, then look at the modern presidency, then we'll look at the president's cabinet, the executive departments and secretaries that run those cabinets, and a brief look at the history of the cabinet. So let's get started. We're going to take a look at the vice presidency, and we're going to start with a former vice president who you see pictured here at the bottom of the screen, and that is Vice President John Adams, who then went on to become president. John Adams said this about the vice presidency, and I quote, "My country has, in its wisdom, contrived for me the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived, or his imagination conceived." End quote. So stop the lecture and write down in your notes what you think Adams meant by this. Also, judge his statement based on your knowledge of the government and on the executive branch itself. I mean, is this true? You can also look at the picture on the right-hand side of your screen as contrast. That's Vice President Dick Cheney, who served under George W. Bush from 2001 to 2009. And look at that and see if you can make sense of that political cartoon. That really gets more at the modern idea of the vice presidency that we'll discuss in a little bit. So, moving forward, looking at the duties of the vice president. I know that the title may have gotten cut off there, but that is the duties of the vice president. Well, we find the duties of the vice president outlined in Article 1, Section 3, Clause 4. That really ought to cause you to shake your head or scratch your head and say, wait a minute, I thought Article 1 was the Congress. Article 2 is the executive branch, and that is true. However, the duties of the vice president actually appear in Article 1. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 4 states that the vice president shall preside over the Senate with no vote except to break ties. So you remember there are 100 senators, and on several occasions there have been votes where it's 50 to 50. If that happens, guess who gets to break the tie? You guessed it, the vice president. So that's one of the vice president's duties. So they preside over the Senate, but it's more a formality, figurehead type of position, except when the Senate ties on an important vote. So this really raises the question, is the vice president part of Congress or a member of the executive branch? Scholars tend to favor the idea that the vice president is part of the executive branch, but there is the question, maybe the vice president is also part of the legislature. So that really is this interesting thing. And remember, the Constitution is not entirely clear, or there are areas that are open to interpretation, and this is yet another one of those, the office of the vice president. Well, let's look at what else the vice president does. The vice president also has the job of presiding over the counting of the electoral college ballots in Congress. Ooh, that's an important job, though. Those electoral college ballots are always counted in December following a presidential election, and it's the vice president's job to make sure that the voting is done properly. And the last thing of the duties of a vice president is the vice president is next in line to succeed the president should the president die in office or otherwise be unable to carry out his or her duties. So to summarize, at this point, stop the lecture again and summarize the three roles of the vice president and answer the question, why don't more American people pay attention to the vice president? I think that's a really good question, don't you? So see what you guys come up with to answer that. Here's an interesting tidbit, factual tidbit. To date, 9 vice presidents have become president because of death primarily. John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, Andrew Johnson, Chester Arthur, I really dig his name, Theodore Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, and Gerald Ford. Of those 9, Gerald Ford's the only one who became vice president because President Richard Nixon resigned the office of the president, and Richard Nixon was the only president to date to resign the office. So in the other 8 previous names I mentioned, they all became president because the president was either assassinated or actually died of natural causes in office. So 9 out of the 44 went on to become president. And you can see there on the right the idea of presidential succession. Right. So we're going to take a look at the early versus the modern vice presidency. And I think we can quickly sum up the early vice presidency with this word, and you see it up there on your screen: sleepy. The vice presidency was sort of an insignificant position. Using John Adams' words, it was soporific, that is sleep-inducing. They really weren't that active, that engaged, that involved. They weren't that known. They weren't visible. This is the early vice presidency, remember. That is going to change. So the vice presidents in the early period of the United States did not attend cabinet meetings. They did not help the president make policies or set goals. They did not help the president really legislate. They really didn't help the president do much of anything except get elected. So, for example, Abraham Lincoln's first vice president was a man named Hannibal Hanlon of Maine. And Lincoln chose Hannibal Hanlon because he felt he needed a New Englander to help him get support in the New England region for his presidency, and it worked. However, when Lincoln ran for re-election in 1864, Lincoln felt he needed support from a Southern Confederate state, and he picked a man, Andrew Johnson, from Tennessee. You have to remember that Tennessee was the first of the Confederate states, or actually the second of the Confederate states, to drop out of the Confederacy and stop fighting in the Civil War. And so Lincoln said, I want Southern support, so he picked Andrew Johnson as his vice president. So really, vice presidents helped presidents get elected. And again, we can turn to the words of Thomas Jefferson, who spoke about the vice presidency, and he said this, and I quote, "A more tranquil and unoffending state could not have been found for me. It will give me philosophical evenings in the winter." End quote. Whereas Theodore Roosevelt stated glibly that the vice president was a stepping stone to oblivion. And I like that quote, a stepping stone to oblivion. That means to nowhere. However, Theodore Roosevelt did go on to become the president. That is something. So he stepped into the role of president by luck and happenstance. So the interesting thing then is this: how many vice presidents have gone on to become president? Now, I mentioned 9 earlier vice presidents who became president, but are there others who maybe served as vice president and then went on to win election in their own right to the presidency? So stop the lecture and do a little bit of research, if you will, and see how many vice presidents went on to become president. So let's turn to the modern vice presidency. And you see the modern vice presidency, I think, is captured best by the man you see pictured. That is Vice President Dick Cheney. Again, he served under George W. Bush from 2001 to 2009. And here he is looking at you with that nice smile on his face, a rather chipper-looking fellow, and he says, "Hi, how are you? I'm the Vice President." He really represents and epitomizes the modern presidency, vice presidency rather, the epitomizes, that is, he captures, he sums up. He had the characteristics of a modern vice president, which in some cases he helped to create. He helped to create that position. So since the 1970s, presidents have really begun to rely more on their vice presidents to help them make policy decisions and carry out presidential programs. Vice President Walter Mondale, who served under President Carter in the late 1970s, started the tradition of a weekly lunch, yum yum, between the president and the vice president. So they meet at least once a week and they have lunch. Very nice tradition, but they then get to share ideas and exchange ideas and talk about policy, talk about goals, etc. President Clinton assigned Vice President Gore the task of revising and reforming the executive branch, something he did, and he did quite effectively. And President George W. Bush involved Vice President Dick Cheney, who you see pictured here, in major foreign policy decisions, including the war in Iraq and energy programs at home. In fact, some argued that Dick Cheney was more the president than Bush. I don't buy that. I don't agree with that. But Dick Cheney, certainly as vice president, was very present. He was very visible, and he was very influential in terms of stating President Bush's goals and actually carrying out those goals, both in foreign policy and in domestic policy. So Dick Cheney had very good relationships with congressmen and used those relationships to help promote President Bush's agenda. So the Vice President's office is now also located close to the President's office, and that is the Oval Office, so that there can be, in addition to the weekly lunch, more frequent interaction. Vice Presidents now attend cabinet meetings, so they attend cabinet meetings. Vice Presidents sit on the National Security Council. They serve as the key advisor to the President, and they also go on a number of trips, both domestic and foreign, to promote the President's ideas and initiatives. So that is a very, very good look, I think, at the modern Vice Presidency right there. So are there any questions? I have a question for you. Why do you think the office of the Vice President became more important and more involved and more visible in the executive branch after almost 200 years of relative inaction in obscurity? So why don't you stop the lecture, jot down some ideas, and bring those to class. So we're now going to turn our attention to the President's Cabinet. President's Cabinet in a circle? Interesting. So you see some images up there. The President's Cabinet is made up of 15 departments. Each department is headed by a secretary. That's what they're called. So the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of Education, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, just to name a few. And you can see that when they do meet in the White House, they sit around a large oval table with the President in the middle, and then the different cabinet secretaries arrayed around the table so that they can discuss and share ideas. And you can see there at the bottom a picture of a presidential cabinet. I believe that is Ronald Reagan from the 1980s. So as I said, the cabinet is simply made up of heads of the executive departments, and the executive departments are responsible for carrying out laws, administering programs, and making regulations and overseeing those regulations in their area of responsibility. I already mentioned that there are 15 executive departments, and the heads of those departments are called secretaries. The main job of the secretary, who is appointed by the President with the advice and consent of the Senate, is to run his or her department. And if you look at page 198, 199 in your textbook, you'll see a list of the 15 departments, and you can see when those departments were created. And when the cabinet secretaries gather at the same time in the same room around that big oval table, they form the President's Cabinet. So when we hear talk of the cabinet, and some presidents have chosen to organize the executive branch around their cabinet, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about these 15 secretaries gathering together with the President and the Vice President, too, to talk about policies, agendas, and issues that the President needs to address. And the President can get the information he needs from the Cabinet Secretary so that the President is in a better position to make decisions. So, are there any questions about that? If not, we're going to move to the history of the cabinet. And again, the word cabinet does not appear in the Constitution. Rather interesting, it doesn't. But we do find in the Constitution this wording, that a president may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer of each of the executive departments. So that's as close as we get to a cabinet. So presidents can require the opinion in writing. So when we go back to George Washington's time, that is how it often worked. The Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, submitted his opinions in long and lengthy reports to the President and to Congress, and they were very important and influential documents. Today, however, you see that the cabinet no longer shares its opinions in writing, although they can still do that, obviously email and texting, etc. But they would typically do this in cabinet meetings around that oval table. So the plan for creating a cabinet was also influenced by the committees that were established under the Articles of Confederation, though those committees were controlled by the legislature. So there were committees under the Articles of Confederation, though there was only a ceremonial president. They carried over the ideas of committees from the Articles of Confederation, and those really become the cabinet positions, the executive offices. President George Washington created the first cabinet, which consisted only of 4 departments and 4 secretaries: the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of War, and the Attorney General. And different presidents used their cabinets for different purposes. Abraham Lincoln loved to appoint cabinet secretaries who held widely differing political views because Abraham Lincoln loved to have debates and arguments. heated arguments, vivacious arguments, so that he could get to the best understanding and the best ideas through those arguments. It's a little bit like writing the essays, right? So at this point, we'll end here. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Bring any questions to class, and thank you very much.